Steph Hay.
Yeah, thank you. In 1966, down the road, actually, this guy, Lloyd Morissette, went to a dinner party hosted by this woman, Joan Gans Cooney. She, at the time, was a producer at, what is the Channel 13, WN... Yes, WNET. Thank you. I always forget it. WNET here, and he was the vice president at the Carnegie Corporation, and they got into this discussion at this dinner party about television, which was becoming ubiquitous. This was in the 60s, and but on television there was a lot of noise, a lot of advertising, particularly for kids. And so they started wondering whether or not they could actually master the addictive qualities of television to do something good with it. And in particular, Lloyd was talking about how his little girls at the time seemed to not be able to retain information that he and his wife would teach them, but they could remember the jingles from, Saturday morning cartoons and commercials pretty easily. So wondering whether or not there was something here to television that they hadn't yet explored. And it just so happened at the time that this guy, whose name is actually Newton Minow, he was a chairman of the FCC. He made this big speech, and if you look it up, it's called the Vast Wasteland Speech. And he said, television is a vast wasteland. Basically, it's total crap. All of the sitcoms and all the children's programming, they all followed the same kind of formulaic approach to their programming, and who knows what the outcome was. So we had this amazing potential medium to be able to reach millions of people and really establish trusting, meaningful connections with them, literally in every single home. And instead it's Batman cartoons where there was violence and commercials selling cereal. So what Lloyd and Joan committed to doing at the time is coming up with an experiment to see whether or not they could actually use television to teach kids. And so they sat down with this hyper-focused programming. And they sat in a studio in Queens, and they put kids literally in front of the TV, and they measured how far away from the TV the kids should be. And they measured what the songs should be like, and they measured whether or not there should be humans and puppets as a means to conveying this information back and forth. And ultimately, they spent over the course of 2 years doing a ton of research to develop the content that was necessary. It was really based on the actual behavioral research that they were doing with this defined measure of success, which is, did kids learn? Could they actually use television? And in fact, really narrowly to the audience of bringing urban youth up to their suburban counterparts in preschool to be able to perform the same as well. Okay, so you all know what this is, right? Obviously, right? So this is the thing. Before there was Sesame Street, there was a ton of research because Sesame couldn't exist without this. The kids needed to be able to trust the programming. They needed to be able to trust what was coming through before they would learn. So it wasn't even just about how far away from the TV that they were sitting. They needed to be able to trust what they were seeing over time in order to learn from it, in order to feel connected to it, in order to have behavioral change happen, systemic behavioral change happen. And now we all know what Sesame Street is. 69 is when it launched. So 66 was the dinner party, and in November of 1969, Sesame Street launched. And now we all know what Sesame Street is. And here's the thing about it, is that even in these initial episodes, the stoop needed to feel like the urban environment. So if you listen to some early episodes, I don't have any here, but if you listen to any early episodes, you hear cars honking in the background, and things are dirty, and the trash is on the ground. And they had to make that look like a scene so the kids would trust that this was real, so that they could even pay attention to what was happening on the screen. They also they brought a whole bunch of different kinds of disciplines together. They brought in child psychologists who said kids who come from abusive homes are more likely to talk to a hand that's got a sock puppet on it than they are to the human that it's attached to. And so child psychologists were doing a bunch of research at this time about how important it was for puppets to be able to reach, that kids could trust that more than they could trust the adults, because they were learning very early on that they couldn't actually trust the humans. So that's how Jim Henson got involved in Sesame Street. And they also found that if it was just puppets, the kids also didn't trust that. Then it was too make-believe. Gosh, they're so high maintenance, these kids. But if they had the right combination of puppets and humans, the puppets essentially represented the innocence and the conscience of the child, and the human represented the authority. And the combination of those things enabled the kid to be able to trust the material. This is a short video, which I hope the sound works for, of a very young James Earl Jones counting to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Hear the horns in the background?
6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Even when they had to learn strictly from adult, turns out that 3 seconds between each of those numbers, not 4, not 2, they tested both, was what they needed to get to this outcome. The kids started counting out loud, the next number in the sequence. They also, James Earl Jones had a bunch of different takes. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he was serious, sometimes he jumped down like that. But it was actually the combination of all of those things plus the 3 seconds that made the kids start counting out loud. It was the variability of it that helped them to trust this human is somebody that they can learn from. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? Well, they had to get this formula right before they could actually scale and start getting into other kind of material. So they tried to take this same formula and go to an older generation, and that's where the electric company came out. And then, of course, as new technologies came out, they built things like new interactive games, etc. And then also they scaled the content itself. So this was an episode after Hurricane Katrina where they started getting into social issues and how do you handle things after a natural disaster. They've talked about divorce. In fact, when Mr. Hooper was one of the original cast members, died in real life, that was the most watched episode of Sesame Street where they talked about death. These are not the things that Sesame Street did on day one. On day one, they had James Earl Jones counting to 10. But it took this much time, and these different disciplines coming together, all focused, hyper focused on being able to consider the emotional state of the kids and being able to create a safe context for the kids to feel trust in order to learn, in order to have the kind of behavioral change that would make a meaningful difference in their lives. They needed the patience and they needed the rigor to be able to do that. They needed to hyper focus on that. And that's exactly what we have to do with AI. Because it's not about the interface. It's about the trust. It's about the relationship. It's about the connection with the person on the other side. And we especially have to work hard because artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence. It's not a human on the other side. Maybe a little bit here and there. But we have to consider the emotional state of the people on the other side. And Diane was talking about this too, with establishing the trust and thinking about the friction points and thinking about the pain points and thinking about the delightful moments and being able to design for those. And so this isn't a new concept, of course, to be able to balance the substance and the emotion. This is a quote from EVP of AI and Research at Microsoft. There are two sides of conversational AI, task completion or productivity side and the emotional side. You need both to truly realize the promise of AI. And here's another quote. The conversations evoke emotion and lead to relationships rooted in trust, empathy, and understanding. They create an experience that has customers paying attention with their hearts and minds. Okay, that's us. We said that. Audra Coakley's-Plummer is our head of design for conversational AI. And she came out of Pixar. She spent 20 years at Lucasfilm, and she worked on Shrek and Ratatouille, and it was all about bringing the character to life, and that's where Eno came from. So Eno, as we talked about a little bit in the introduction, is one spelled backwards? Yes. Eno is a gender-neutral assistant that we launched last year at South by Southwest for all of our customers to be able to, as at first, we started very narrow in the SMS channel where we could study all the raw language. In fact, our language scientist is standing in the back. Our head of experiments is standing in the back as well. And being able to understand all of the variability and the sentiment and, of course, the substantive use cases that we needed to serve, the raw text is our data, right? So that's why we decided to start in the SMS channel. But we know, of course, that money, even though money is transactional, that's only half of it, right? So Eno can answer all of these questions that people might ask. And we could definitely start there. In fact, we did start there. But the raw data showed us that people also say things like this: I'm afraid to ask my balance. And right now, Eno, who's a warm and human character, responds with, happy to share that with you. So we've got some work to do. Why don't I ever have enough money, Eno? I just got fraud alert and I'm scared someone stole my identity. Here's where you can go resolve fraud. These are the kinds of starting baby steps that we're getting into, but really recognizing through the research the kinds of things that people are wanting to talk about. This is about humanity. This is not about money. This is about emotion. This is about people. Money is just the catalyst for those. We are doing some things right so far. There are hundreds of ways people have said thank you to Eno in the millions of conversations that we've had so far. There are hundreds of ways people have said, I love you. Someone thinks Eno's a dude. I love you, bro. Yeah, that's right. And people between 4.5 and 5 stars, people are enjoying the interactions that we've been having so far. But ultimately, again, we still have a lot of work to do. So here's another video I want to show you of a customer. The context here is that this customer lives in San Diego and ended up coming to New York for some board meetings, and his wife went out to do a little shopping while they were in New York. And he got a fraud alert from Capital One. He's a customer. And he got a fraud alert just to make sure everything was okay. So here's what he has to say about it. Wait a minute. Maybe. What's your name? Lloyd Morrison. Lloyd, how did you feel when your wife bought all those things while you were in the board meetings, and then you got an email asking you to approve the transactions?
Well, I was really glad to get the email and know that Capital One was on the ball checking fraud. I had no problem with all they had to do with it. One went in and said, yes, I do recognize these transactions.
Did it make you feel good?
It made me feel pretty good. I thought that you were safe.
Thank you. Also, do you think Steph Hay is like the coolest person ever? Damn it. Yeah, that's Lloyd Morissette. Lloyd is a customer of ours, and Lloyd is also the co-creator of Sesame Street. Yeah, listen to that. That's right. I'm really fortunate to call Lloyd a friend and mentor ever since I studied Sesame Street when I was in grad school for journalism years and years ago. But ultimately, Lloyd is representing that emotional state. And I trusted Capital One in that moment because Capital One reached out to me just to make sure everything was okay. It made me feel safe, he said. That's an outcome. That's a measurable outcome. It is the power of bringing together AI and humanity through great design. But again, it's all about considering the emotion. The emotional state is an outcome beyond just the transactional or measurable outcome that we might be able to measure in a digital behavior. That's what's really necessary to instill trust. That's it. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Steph.